Well, Republicans are now inching closer to a narrow House majority south of the border as ballot counting continues in key midterm races.
For a closer look at the results, we are joined by Olivier Knox, Daily 202 author at the Washington Post. Thank you so much for joining us. So we know that the Republicans need 2 more seats. How do you see this playing out?
I think it's going to play out to end up with a very, very narrow Republican majority in the House, one that's actually going to make things very complicated for the person everyone expects to become Speaker, Congressman Kevin McCarthy of California. He'd hoped for a much wider margin that would leave him less reliant on what I will call the Donald Trump wing of the party. That now appears not to be in the cards. In terms of the Senate, in Nevada and Arizona, 2 of the outstanding contests where ballots are still being counted, Democrats are cautiously optimistic that at the end of the day they will eke out narrow majorities, but both of those could go either way, and that means that we're going to focus once again on a early December runoff election in the southern state of Georgia. Raphael Warnock, the incumbent, having won one last time around. He's now pitted against former football star Herschel Walker, the Republican Trump-endorsed candidate.
Yeah, Olivier, it really all comes down to Georgia. Again, it's pretty remarkable. History is repeating itself this time. But if you go back, you know, the Trump-endorsed candidates, you know, a couple of nights ago didn't do as well as perhaps, well, certainly as well as Donald Trump was expecting, but also just as well as some people had been anticipating. How is that going to shift things in the Republican Party?
That is a very good question. You're right. A lot of Donald Trump's favored candidates, I'll give one prominent example, Dr. Oz, the celebrity who ran in Pennsylvania, lost. That's unsettled people inside the Trump camp because Trump came out and campaigned pretty aggressively for him. Other Trump-aligned candidates in significant battlegrounds lost. And that's leading people to take a second look at a candidate who did very, very, very well on Tuesday, and that is the Republican governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who's thought of, at least in the news media, as Donald Trump's most likely serious rival for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. So it's still a little early. People are taking notice that the Rupert Murdoch news empire seems to be souring on Donald Trump. That doesn't mean very much. The Republican base doesn't really take its cues from the Murdoch empire, but it's still notable. It does mean that there's a category of Republican that feels pretty good today. It's the more traditional Republicans, people like the governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan.
And Olivier, you know, the Republicans are really hoping for a red wave to happen, but a lot of these Trump-endorsed candidates didn't do so well. What do you think is the reason for that? Their lack of experience, perhaps?
Well, a lot of them embraced some pretty kooky views. That's one problem. You know, Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate minority leader, said a few months ago that he was concerned about candidate quality. That was not a particularly veiled reference to some of the more extreme candidates, the folks who denied the legitimacy of President Biden's election. That hurt them. Another thing that hurt them was the Supreme Court decision some months ago overturning the guarantee of access to abortion. That played an enormous role. That brought women, and particularly young women, out in droves. We've seen also, although this bears a little more analysis, but we saw a remarkable youth turnout in this election. And the young people under 30, went for the Democrats by just an overwhelming margin. So that's worth looking at as well. And then the idea that, you know, so democracy was on the ballot, access to abortion was on the ballot. There were things other than inflation that shaped a lot of Americans' views when they went to vote.
And Olivier, what is this overall going to mean to sort of how laws actually get made in the U.S. going forward for the next couple of years? All right, with the shift in the House and the razor-thin margin in the Senate, how much has really changed, and how difficult is it going to be, for example, for Joe Biden to move his agenda forward?
Sure. Let's just focus on the House. If, in fact, it ends up in Republican hands, Biden's legislative agenda pretty much grinds to a halt. It is hard to imagine a narrow Republican majority moving ahead with some of the things that he'd hoped to accomplish in a second term, such as additional legislation to combat the climate crisis. That is not a popular cause among Republicans. So you can see his legislative agenda sort of grinding to a halt. You can see more brinksmanship. There are a lot of right-wing Republicans who want to use the fight over annual government appropriations, for example, as leverage. They want to use the debt ceiling, the annual or not annual, the regular debate about how much America can borrow. They want to use that to get concessions. So that could trigger a couple of crises. On a more mundane level, what it means is that House committee chairs will all be Republican. And that's very important. That means that the people who decide what to have hearings about, whom to call to testify, what investigations to open. Those are all really important. And we know that Republicans have promised investigations that could be politically painful for the president. Looks at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a look at his Inflation Reduction Act, a look into his son's finances, Hunter Biden's finances. And they've talked, although it's not clear they're going to do this, they've talked about creating a select committee to look at U.S.-China relations, probably in a pretty confrontational way. So that's really going to set the table for the next couple of years.
Okay, a lot of interesting dynamics there. Olivier Knox, Daily 202 author at The Washington Post. Appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you.
My pleasure.